Steve Schwarz. I'm going to talk a little bit about Cypress and end-to-end testing. I am not an expert on Cypress or end-to-end testing, but it was a tool I picked up to solve a problem at work, and I got really kind of excited about how easy it was to use, so I thought I'd just share what I learned, and you guys can see if I'm a big fat liar. So end-to-end testing, right? Typically, most people think of it as you're acting as the end user. You're using whatever interface the end user gets. If you're doing end-to-end testing, you're typically going to interact the same way as a user would, and often with the full stack of backend services, unmocked, unstubbed, whatever your world is there. They're really nice, but because you're going clicky, 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 typey, 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 this can be a lot slower than hitting some APIs, right? And one of the other problems with it is it's hard to see what happens when errors occur, because supposedly the system's working right, those errors won't be showing up. So Cypress was kind of built around end-to-end testing and really more towards integration testing. And there's an article they wrote about, I have to make this bigger. This is the classic picture of the testing pyramid, where at the bottom are unit tests, where typically you're testing a single class, a single function. Then you might move up to the integration phase where, hey, let's see how these two classes work together, or these functions compose together. And then lastly is end-to-end testing, where you try to have work across a wider swath of the application. So what Cypress tries to do is it works in the browser, your tests run in the browser, but because of that, you can also kind of move down you can move out of clicky land and actually interact directly with the DOM, directly with XHR requests, and so on. So that's kind of a pretty cool part about Cypress. Right, so it gives you access to everything in the browser. So that also means you can install any browser node packages and run those as part of your test. You might use them as part of your setup, part of your teardown, or to mess with the application itself. Of course, you can monkey patch stuff too. So why I like Cypress, right? It's a freebie. It's in beta right now. They're going to be opening up for paid premium service. Kind of where they're looking to make their money, at least my interpretation, is in continuous integration setups. Because when you're running continuous integration, you don't get to see the head of the app. You can't see what's going wrong or what's going right. So a key feature of Cypress is they actually record all the interaction on a headless Chromium or Electron, I think it is. And then in their premium service, they'll save that video along with screenshots of every failed test. So you can just let your CI run, and then you get some alert that says, and then you can go there and see, this is what. Is that tied into their, the dashboard service? It's the dashboard service is what they call it. So that's pretty cool. What makes Cypress different than a lot of other testing things is it runs right in the browser. It doesn't use Selenium, and I think WebDriver, is the API. It doesn't preclude you from doing that, but in general, it doesn't do that. Another nice thing about it is you just npm install it. It just works. So there's no million jar files you're dropping all over the place, and I was like, oh, thank God. It was really easy to install. And the documentation, I was just raving to other folks around here. This barely big enough to see. There's nothing specific I wanted to show on here. But the thing I like about it is they have very in-depth docs, and specifically their API docs are very good. This is like their get function. Everything's hung off of an object called sci in a global space. And they give you, how it works, all the arguments, you give it options, they give you a whole slew of examples. And then what's more interesting is they tend to give you expanded examples, not just the simple way to use it, but the way that you might actually use it, which is pretty cool. And it goes on and on. I'm not gonna, we're not gonna look at documents, but they have useful links, and even better is they use a nice, their search thing gives you this company Algolia I want to know more about, because this is a really nice search mechanism they have, and it lets you find stuff right away in their docs. So that helped sell me, because I'm the kind of guy who's going to try to do something, and then I just start hitting the docs when it all goes wrong. That's what I try, how I work. So when you do that npm install, it bundles in all these guys: Mocha, Chai, Sign-In, Lodash, Moment, jQuery. They're all built right in. You don't need to install them yourself. You don't need to use them either, but if you can just use them right away. They kind of say it's a no-flake system. So what they try to do by flake typically means, this test failed, but if I run it again, it runs fine. That's classic example of flake, right? And you really don't want that if you're going to try to use continuous deployment, try to implement continuous deployment. If your tests are just randomly failing, you have no confidence in the tests, and then they get commented out, and then you have less confidence in your product. So what they do instead is like that get one I just showed you, which would be like get an element out of the DOM. It'll actually has a configurable delay in it where it'll keep watching the DOM events and say, is it there now? Is it there now? Is it there now? Oh, the element's there now. So you don't have to put in waits or delays. It just works. And I've almost never had to put a wait in my code. So as I talked about, it lets you debug right in the browser. It gives you a graphical playback. I'll show you all that in action. And a really cool feature that I played with a lot at work was that app is an Angular app, is talking to a REST service, and the REST service is going through a lot of changes. Like we added authentication, we added permissions, and it just broke a whole bunch of stuff. So I was able to inspect all the XHR requests and put assertions on the data I'm getting back from the server, and I could blow up right away as soon as I got the request in and say, oh, this is not what I'm expecting. And I could talk to the back-end engineer and say, was this what we said we were going to do? And we can negotiate what the API is supposed to be. So that would work really nice. So let's actually talk about testing. We're going to test against an Ionic app I might have demoed here a long time ago that I still haven't shipped. So I guess with side projects. And I'll just show you some simple tests that I kind of came up against this app. The thing about this app is it's running Angular. It's running, all its data is stored locally in PouchDB, so there's no real XHR going on. Everything just happens locally. So it's kind of not as interesting to test as an example as I might have used in retrospect. So let's look at tests. I thought we'd have more resolution than that. I made a giant there, didn't I? That's a little too giant. So let me see if I still have, I don't have Cypress running. So let's start Cypress.
Did it kill the resolution after you started recording?
No, you didn't check that.
I didn't double check after I had, after we monkeyed with it. So Cypress starts up a little runner guy, and this guy doesn't, for whatever reason, Command plus doesn't make it bigger, so it's not tied into. But we don't care about that. It lists basically all your integration tests. So you create a spec file, a classic JavaScript test file, and I'll show you what that looks like. Here, let's make this bigger. So the way the runner works is it runs your app in a window, and then on this one I can make bigger, and then it runs through each of the steps. And at each step, there's only one step here, so it's kind of boring. It makes a snapshot of what the screen actually looked like at that moment. So you can actually go through every single step, and I will show you that in action. So let's look at a test. Test, basically, you give it a describe. It's just kind of an outer function, an outer object that holds it. So these are all Mocha. These are all in the Mocha test framework. You can name each one, and then you give it a function that it runs. Oh, that looks pretty good, huh? So here's our Sci object I mentioned before that Cypress injects into the world, into the global space. You can tell it to visit a URL, and then you can say, okay, go get it. Then this waits for it to actually load, and then it says the URL should equal this constant string up here. Just the basic test, did the page load? Right? Very straightforward. And when that ran, this is what it looked like. Easy peasy, right? If you folks have any questions, just holler right now. So let's look at a more interesting test. I'll uncomment it and then we can talk about it. So you can, in Mocha and a million other test frameworks, you can have a method that runs before anything else runs. It runs once for that set of tests. So here I'm going to say, hey, do what I just did before, visit the page, make sure the URL is right, and then check the DOM for a class called loaded. So since my thing is hitting this pouch database and it loads a whole bunch of records to kind of make it work, there's no actual, what would happen in the real mobile app is the splash screen drops when it's done. But since I'm in just running the JavaScript here, your only way to know is me setting this class in the DOM. So that's my trigger to know that it's done. So once that's done, we can set up also the notion of things that happen before each test. Once again, a common thing. So here I'm saying go and get some buttons. So if we look at the app here, I'm getting these 3 buttons: layouts, maps, places. And so you just define Cypress supports jQuery selectors built in. So, and they're basically CSS selectors. If you're used to CSS, it's the same syntax. So you say, hey, go get it. But then Cypress introduces this notion of an alias where you can say, hey, go grab this chunk of stuff. And then later on, you can go and look for it, right? So these and all the before each, I set up all these selectors. And then here's another test that says, hey, let's see if the layouts button exists. And does it contain the word layouts? So this contains function is kind of cool in that it doesn't just read inner HTML of the top level thing. It'll just plow all the way down deep into it till it gets some text strings out of it. So you can really be you can be as sloppy or not as sloppy as you want to be, or more as specific, I should say, as you want to be to selecting stuff. And it'll just pull the text out and does it contains. So if that button said Steve's layouts, this would still match if that's what you want it to do. So here we have aliases, and then the next one is you can chain things together, right? So I can do a get. It should be visible. I forget which package does these. I think this is chai. I think these are chai assertions.
It's an assertion, so yeah.
Yeah. So I can say get it, make sure it's actually visible. The thing that kind of messed with me a little bit in Cypress that's actually kind of a cool feature is they'll actually check if an element is truly interactable. So is it covered by another element? Has it got 0 size? Is it, I think those are the 2 main things they check for. So that's kind of nice because I actually had some elements in my app where they were 0 by 0. I'm like, they show up on the screen and they still work, but Cypress warned me like, this may not really be clickable, accessible in the way you think.
You gotta force true.
So I threw some CSS in there and made it bigger.
I
Or you could force true on it and
dealt
say,
with
I don't
the
care, select it anyway, even if it's 0 size or covered up.
I dealt with the same problem in SVG just recently, and I was like, it's right there, but Cypress was like, nah, there's nothing there. And the only way around it was to throw in like a little, it's just an object like force true.
Right.
And it goes
It
out.
is, yeah, so all these methods, like the get here, a lot of them will take an extra configuration option to change how it works by default. And lastly, of course, just checking that stuff exists is pretty boring. You can click on things and you can type on things. You can double click, you can hover, you can, any interaction you would expect, it works. The other nice thing is the test runner, as soon as you save the spec files, it detects it and reruns the commands. So here's a more interesting thing, and you can see as I go down each element, it highlights each of the selectors. So it helps you also kind of debug, are you really selecting what you think you're selecting? this was like a killer feature to me. I was like, this is really cool. I got pretty excited. Yes, I'm a nerd, but I'm pretty excited about that. And here's our get and the contains and so on. So that's that's the way it works. And see, here's our before each, and it's going to run before each test, as you would expect. Make sense? Everybody with me? Easy peasy. Okay. I'm sure I'm going to get some commenting wrong here, and then it'll all blow up, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so let's look at a little more interesting test, fractionally more interesting. So now I want to actually start using more features like actually typing stuff in, checking that it works, clicking on buttons. So I have this notion of and the other nice thing about this is it's still live, right? So even in this window, it's still live. You can play with it, and if you're not like a real CSS person, you can use their inspector, and it'll tell you what the string is that you could use to match things. I always just go to DevTools and use the real inspector.
That's the other thing, is you have DevTools here too.
Yeah, good point. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for reminding me that I should have said that. Yeah, so you have the full. You can see the console, see all the magic that goes on there, and you can still inspect, through all the regular DevTool magic. Yeah, so when stuff goes wrong, one of their best practices is actually to not clean up your tests at the end. They like to clean them up in the befores, which is not how I ever tested, so it kind of messed with my brain a little bit. But their notion then is at the end of the test, if something went wrong, you're always in a situation where you can then click on the app and figure out what went wrong and then fix your test. So I think it's pretty helpful in the test development stage. I think it's an interesting approach. So we're gonna create places. This application, it's not that important for you guys to know, but it's basically I play a game with my dogs called Dog Agility. It's an obstacle course competition for dogs and people. And one of the things you do is they give you a map at each course, and you never know what it's going to be. So you come to a competition, they're like, here, go do this. And people like to collect these maps so you can practice them outside of the competition, so you're less surprised when you show up, right? So the notion is you have a place like your backyard. Your backyard might be a place where I would set up a map. So that's what this app is all about, is collecting these map images and letting you set them up in your own place. So we're going to define a place. So I just define a bunch of constants so I can type stuff in to my dialog and then test that they're actually there at the end, because that's probably what would be a useful test. So here I'm going to click on this menu thing, and that actually, the menu places button, and that takes time for that view to actually load in Angular. So you might think you'd need to add a wait statement, but in practice I found I've not had to, in that if I just wait for things to contain something, it'll just hang out and try until that element contains the word places. It'll keep retrying. So I don't need to wait on the click. I just say assert that places.title has the word places in it.
Does it ever stop waiting? Like, is there a timeout?
There's a timeout.
Okay.
There's a global timeout that you can set that it comes set, I think, in like 5 seconds. You can set that to a different number, and then you can override it any place along the chain if that's helpful to you.
Steve, what is places?
Excellent question. I just realized I was going to talk about that.
Okay.
Selectors. This isn't normally the screen colors I'm used to, so my head's all messed up. So you saw before I was using their alias concept of you can define a string to match a selector. What I've always done in the olden times was just wump up an object, give it some properties, and inside those properties are the actual selector. So then I can just refer to a menu.layouts button everywhere, and if I change my markup, I just go into this file and change all the markup, however my new CSS went, as opposed to going back. If I did that, Where'd you go here? You know, if I had code like this scattered all through my app, I'd have to go find it in all my specs, and I would hate myself. So you'd only make that mistake once, probably, probably in your life. So that's what menu.places is. So that's just for me not using their alias concept. So places.title. So hopefully they have names that are meaningful to me. Hopefully they're meaningful to other people too. So here I'm gonna go and say, let's actually create one of these guys. So I'm gonna, once I have launched, I hate that highlighting thing. So I'm gonna say, hey, click the add place button, then make sure I'm on the page, type in some text. So place name is home measured in feet. Set up types, like clicking on a button. Then I'm verifying that some default value based on that button it actually was set. And type in some more stuff, and then I click the save button. So basically I'm gonna fill in a dialog, and I'm gonna save it. Then I say, okay, after that save, I should go back to my list view. All right, did I get there? The way I'm checking is the title changed to the list view name? Pretty straightforward. And then I've got a little badge on the left-hand side, like this guy here. That should now say 1, right? If I've added a place, I should get a little button, a little badge that says, you've got 1 now. So I'm just walking through just like a user would do. Type in this, click that, click that, click that. And then I make some tests to see, okay, so when I've added, and then I'm gonna, so it's gonna look similar to this, and I'm just verifying that each of the texts match what I expect the texts to be. And then I'm gonna play around with some dialogues and say, okay, delete the thing you just added. So now I have a full test of going from nothing, creating, making sure it's in the list, and then wiping it out, and I should be back to where I started. So let's save that and see what happens.
What if so this is like it tests the full stack, so there's like a database potentially behind it.
Sure.
So how do you write your tests in a way that, like, what if there's already places in your database?
Mm-hmm.
And so like you're checking for one place, but somebody else put some stuff there already.
Right. There's a few ways you can do it. On the other system I'm working on, we have a shared database that for dev. So I just have very unique names, and then I clobber them by name. So the API for that system is a REST API. So you do the painful thing, you know, get it with this crazy name. Did you get something back? Post delete against it. Oh, you didn't get something back? Must be okay. So in the before, I just have a whole bunch of XHR calls I make that wipe out the old nasty data and then drop in, and I'll show that in here, drop in the good data.
You can, and if you're going to talk about this one, but you can intercept.
Right.
Decide
I'm not going to talk
what-
about this, but yes.
So you can. So if there's an endpoint that your application is going to hit, you can do side.request and then put in what that endpoint is, and then put in the next argument is what data that endpoint
That's
should return.
nuts.
And it'll just, when your application makes
Whenever
that
it hits it.
SHR call,
That's
it will give back whatever you just told it to get. So you can just acknowledge that the API exists and fill your test your test with whatever data you want. And there's a lot of documentation and blog posts on Cypress about like which way is right. Should you hit your live API? Should you stub out and mock up your API?
Right.
They both have their pros and cons, but you can definitely do it if you're going to hit something weird and it just doesn't make sense to deal with the actual API. You can just populate your data source.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, and it's nice you can give it a fixture or you can give it a function. So if you can give it a function, you can do whatever the heck you want, right? So
when you do side.request, you are not actually making the request. You are telling Cypress to wait for the application to make that
it's
request.
saying this thing could happen, is what side request is. It's basically, here's a regular expression that I want you to match against all the XHR requests. And then when you do a wait, then you could say wait for this possible list of those expressions, or aliases for those expressions, basically is what you give it. Does that make sense? Okay, so
Can you directly record the steps that you take from the UI itself?
from the command line it records everything, but in the UI it doesn't. I can show you the video in a second for how. That's one of the last things I'll show. So here's my test running. So I get so that little red dot down there is when it clicked the button, and you can see it does the transition from the button to the dialog that just came up. And then it's filling in text, clicking buttons. So there it entered a 10, and so it's just so nice to use. It's so easy to use. And so then one of the things you see, so it lists everything out, and what I've started doing at work, because some of my scenarios at work are pretty long, they have a logging thing, so you can just say sci.log, and it'll just drop that text into this left-hand column. So when you have a bunch of stuff that's like editing this dialog, setting up, getting to the list, checking it, I actually put text in there. So you're not just set with a sea of get, type. It gives you an anchor where you can like, oh, I realize where we are in the test when you're trying to figure out what's going on. But typically what will happen is you get to some error, and then you want to highlight it. So here we are, we've created a thing, and now I'm going into the delete steps, deleting it, and then you could, I check that the badge is not existing here. And so that was, just a classic way of going through, a full user scenario. It really didn't take that long for me to do it. And it runs in reasonable time. 10 seconds is a long time for a test, in reality, right? You'd like to have, at least 100 tests run in there, if not 1,000 tests. 1,000 unit tests in there should be totally doable. They do run faster from the command line, because it's not, I think, at least on my machine, it's not doing all this work to update the screen. It just rips through them a lot faster.
Yeah.
But it's not 10 times faster. It's still.
Is there an option to disable the screen captures?
When you run from the command line, it only captures the failures.
Okay.
So it
Because that
records
might be what takes a long time.
I think it's just how slow my app is in this case. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't
I
think
think
I
you
can.
can turn that stuff off, though. I know with the video stuff, you can set the dimensions
Yeah.
or all sorts of stuff. So if there's a Cypress JSON file, right?
Yes, that has all the config in it.
Yeah.
I'm kind of getting near the end of my time here. I don't want to take away
It's
from.
like 15 minutes.
Hey, you're fine.
Oh, really? I don't want to take. Mark's way more fun.
Mark's early.
Okay.
You're not even supposed to be here
Mark's
for
still
15
writing his presentation.
Oh, okay. That's fine.
Far more than that.
Okay, so we can look at a couple more tests and a couple more things. So obviously you don't want all your tests to be clicky, clicky, clicky like that, right? Because it takes a long freaking time. So what Cypress lets you also do is define your own methods on the Cypress object. But of course you can always just call functions. You don't have to add them to the Cypress object. You can just write a function that says, add my data to the database. But I kind of wanted to give you a demonstration of what that looks like. So they have a file called commands. And in my case, I'm using PouchDB, as I said, in the browser. And all the IDs for these objects in the database are UUIDs, so I import that module. And I have some helper functions, which is basically set up the database, create it with a specific name that matches my user, and then I export the actual database itself. And ultimately, I add a Cypress command called add place to DB. You can give it an object. If there aren't objects, it makes up some data. And then I just say, hey, go put this in the database. So anytime I have, so before my tests, I can just say, hey, go populate a place. I want to do something with it. So here's all it takes to do that. And now I can do that same delete test in many fewer steps, right? I can delete from that list view, but I can also go to the individual detail record and delete on the detail record. So this is a test of deleting on the detail record. So I bring it up, I edit it, and then I grab the delete button, and I go through the little modal dialog to delete it, just like I did from the list view. And you'll see it'll spend a little more work in the before case to load the database, but it's pretty fast locally. So that's all it does. Hey, this looks like something. Oh, I'm sitting on a button. That's why. Why is it flashing? It's like I was kind of hoping for an error so we could debug an error or something. No such luck. So you can define your own commands that do whatever you want. You can, as you were asking about, you can preload the data with whatever mechanism. Here I hit the database. In my work, I use the REST API. And I think the last thing I want to talk about is you can just run them from the command line, and that'll generate the. It's a very small font. Yep, buttons. So here, is that really tiny? Yeah. So you basically just kick it off. It always gives you this weird warning. So here I run it. It tells you what Cypress version it's running. It runs against a headless electron, is where it captures its video. You can give it a specific spec file to run or run all of them, whatever you want it to do. It runs them. It took 4 seconds to load. So it's faster than, that's a fair amount faster. It's like half, it's twice as fast as me running it otherwise. And here they all passed. If something failed, it'll tell you, hey, that's one thing I didn't talk about was Cypress has really good error messages. Like here it said it couldn't do the click because the element, blasted. The element is not visible. I was trying to make it bigger. Because it has, here's that 0 size warning. So when something goes wrong, they really give you a lot of feedback about why. So that's pretty cool. Then it gives you, here's the results, and here's a screenshot of that failure. And so let's see if I can find where so here's a screenshot. So it's, it colors it in red, and so it's not as helpful, but it's actually talking about this button here. But at least gives me what the selector was, so I know what that selector was. And the video basically just runs just shows you the full test running. So the real argument for this, as I mentioned before, is in a continuous integration environment, is you don't know why it failed. And you can now go to their dashboard and see, oh, here's why it failed. Here's the screenshots, and here's
You could also you could do Cypress open, run it here, then jump to where it failed, and inspect it out.
Right, assuming, because I have seen where it runs from the command line, it's running faster.
Sure.
And so I did see a flake maybe, where it failed running. It was actually this case where it was 0 size, because my selector wasn't as good a selector as I probably should have used. So I changed my selector, and then it worked the same on the command line as on the app itself. So that's pretty cool. Some browser window here has something useful. Okay. So we went through all that. So this is off of their best practices. His name is Gleb Bamutov, and Brian Mann gave a good 2-part presentation at a recent conference whose name escapes me. But this is the link to the slides, and I'll have some links at the end too, about some best practices. And so they're saying, hey, don't just clicky to build up your state. Write some methods that'll populate a known state the way you want it. It's going to be way faster. Don't couple your tests together. So don't count on a previous test putting data in place so that the next test it'll magically have a place. In my example, that would be bad. And the other reason to do that is they want to parallelize all these tests. They're just pushing a recent feature. I think just pushed it, where you'll be able to then say, hey, spam these tests across a whole bunch of servers so they all run in parallel. So that way, since they could still run properly because they won't depend on each other, which is a good thing. And as I pointed out before, you have native access to everything, so you don't necessarily have to click through stuff. You can get access to the code and call methods yourself if they're accessible. So that was all, it's all rosy, right? This is the perfect test framework. It is fantastic. It kicks butt all over the place. Well, no, it is not, and they don't pretend it is, and they have this nice page, which I just copied this right out of. It's not a general purpose automation tool, so it's not gonna let you use it for screen scraping or running across a bunch of web pages to do some activity. It's really meant to run inside a single browser window, running a single app, or a single set of pages or apps or whatever it is. Because it runs in the browser, it'll never support multiple browser tabs. So you're not going to have something where you launch another one and then go work in that one and then come back. It's never going to support that. Same thing, can't do two browsers at the same time. The bigger challenge is the single origin challenge, in that they don't want, our app at work uses Azure, our Active Directory for login, and it's OAuth 2, and they don't support, as far as I can tell, an API where you can just say, username, password, log me in, give me back an auth token. You have to go through their crazy little multi-step wizard in a separate domain, and then it redirects back with your token. So what I had to do was write a separate little script that goes and logs me in and hands back the token. And then my Cypress test loads the token from a file, and now I can be that user.
I do the exact same thing.
That seems to be that's the common answer. Or and I only have to do that because my backend server checks the tokens, right? If I was mocking out or stubbing out the backend server just with fixtures, I wouldn't have to go through that dance at all because I'm controlling my world. If you can create a token from your own server, if you go to your server and say, hey, log me in server and get back your token, then you're golden too, because it's just an XHR request. So, but it's just if you're going to go hopping to other domains to do stuff and you need it back, that it gets complicated.
Are you okay with XHRs to other origins? It's
Yeah.
just if the browser moves to a
The
different-
browser moves is the
So it can
catch.
XHR to wherever it
Yes.
needs to. Okay,
Yes,
fine.
yes. That's the
So
beauty of
like Google login. If you try to do Google login through Cypress, there's endless amounts of issues and articles about how to achieve it. And Cypress's move is basically like, well, you shouldn't be doing that.
Don't do that. Yeah, that's not-
Why you doing
Why are
that?
you testing login? Is really what it boils down to there. Their argument is, why are you testing this third party's login?
Yeah.
What's the point? What's the benefit of doing that? So, okay, whatever. But the other thing that irks people is, it's Chrome. In today's world, do you need to test multiple browsers? Some people say yes, some people say no. But the question is, and for every single test, right? That's your gut feel. My gut feel is, oh, we still got those guys in IE8. We got to be sure it works. It's like, do we really have to be
Yes,
sure?
dude, we do.
Okay. But do you need an automated test? Do you need an automated test for it? That's the other question. So the good news is they are providing their driver world. They're building out drivers for these other browsers. It's not like it's never going to support them. So Firefox is supposedly close to shipping. And then I forget what the list order is, but the question is, are they going to do IE other than Edge? And the answer is probably not. They're going to be modern. My bet is they're going to be modern browsers, which makes sense.
And the concern is, are they going to try up with all the new versions of every browser they are going to support? That's going to be a tough thing.
Right, well, it depends. I don't know what their interface level is. I mean, it's really, it really depends what APIs they're hitting to make the Cypress magic work. I think I don't know. I've never looked at any of the code under the covers. It's all open source, so one could cut a PR for Edge support or IE8 or whatever it is. So.
What about mobile browsers? Is there anything that even have?
That's why I could use it for mine, because it's Ionic is just a JavaScript app, you know, just an
Right,
Angular
right,
app,
right.
but I think I don't think that fits the model.
Right.
It's not running in a browser, unless there's a way you can run it in a.
But Mark's not here, so antivirus.
So there are other better presentations than mine available at these places.
I disagree, sir.
Hmm?
I disagree.
Thank you very much. No, but they have, you know, I raved about their docs. Their presentations are good. Their slides are good. These guys are very professional, and on their GitHub issues, could they be any nicer to the people submitting issues? It's just bizarre. It's so not open source. You know, they're like, please try this. Oh, here's an easy thing, repo you can use to reproduce your error. And so like, boom, go. Oh, they have Docker images for a lot of this stuff if you're going to use it to run on CI. This is it.
So you cannot run it in mobile, but can you change the resolution of the test and kind of like impersonate the?
Yeah, if you have multiple breakpoints, you can set the viewport size.
That could kind of be easier.
Right. So yeah, that's an excellent question.
So if it runs in the browser, how do you make it part of your server build process? So you
Just a command, you just run it.
You just run
see
it.
how I ran it without the GUI?
but it has to be running on your build server.
Well, it has to be installed with all the rest of your
With your stuff,
packages.
right.
I mean,
Okay.
Right. So when my assumption is you would do npm install -d, get you all your dev your packages installed, which would include Cypress, and then you run the server, right? So the piece I left out of this was right in another window. I've got my app actually running, right? So it's hitting this server. So somewhere is your server under test is running, and then the test code runs and pounds against that. So you know, you could spin both of them up in continuous integration land, right? You would run your tests and your test server talk, and then you tear them all down, and the way you would go.
So you mentioned at one point you had to add a loaded class to check if something was
I
loaded,
had
right?
to.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you find yourself having to refactor your app frequently to kind of allow Cypress to work, or is it just sort of like?
I had this. That was strange because at work I didn't have to do that because I have all these XHR requests for pretty much every page. So as soon as those have fired, I know all my drop downs are populated, and I'm like, oh, so the page is totally there. If everything that filled in all the modals or drop downs if those requests have come through, I'm sure the page is loaded at that point.
Although I would say when you're both developer and writing integration tests,
Yeah.
that's kind of a natural outcome. All of a sudden you start putting more IDs and classes on stuff
Right.
because you don't want to select the end of this
Right.
where the text equals that. So you start kind of, it's exactly what you said, but it also just makes sense.
Yeah,
You
right.
just
It's not a
kind
bad
of do
thing.
it.
It's just
Right. They like their recommendations use the data attribute on things,
Right.
which
It's
bugs
kind of gross.
me.
We did that with Selenium, and it was like it just flooded everything with data attributes.
Right. And so I mix and match. If it's something way down the tree, like a button that I know I'm going to hit, I'll probably put a data attribute on it. But otherwise, I'll use it. I have classes on everything.
Right.
So usually the classes are brilliantly named, so they're a perfect match every time.
Integration test is the reason I use IDs.
Yeah, I'm trying to use it, like I'm coming up with some new screens for new things, so I'm writing the test right away as opposed to backfitting a bunch of tests to make it all work. And then you're right, the code is more for testing.
I know you showed the commands file. Have you done much with plugins yet?
No, I haven't. There's a notion of plugins where you can hook into the events spit out by Cypress itself as it runs.
Yeah.
So you could do stuff, I guess, on load and before each test.
So what I do is I need a whole bunch of IP addresses from different Docker machines, and those may change from one time I ran it to another time I ran it, depending on who fired up the Docker machines. So in commands, I actually have like on their config. So there's a Cypress JSON file that you can set a bunch of configuration stuff in. What size to make the window. You can have environmental variables there, or environment variables. So I actually run a node command to list out the URLs or the IP addresses that I need, and then inline I just grep those and create an object and then shove that into my Cypress JSON dynamically, into the config dynamically. I don't rewrite the file. I just say the config now equals this, and then anywhere I call, I say go to whatever URL. It's just an environmental or an environment variable now.
Yeah,
So
I
it's
just-
super handy for anything that you might not be positive about and you need to set after the fact. You can dynamically write your configuration or in memory. I mean, you don't actually write a new file.
Oh, right. Yeah, and you can, like I said, you can pass in any number of environment variables as it runs too. So I do that for all my API endpoints. If I'm running local versus test environment versus demo environment, you can test against any of those as a smoke test. So. Well, cool.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Steve.